Hi everybody, today I'm going to tell you the story of a medieval duel, and like the one that was the cornerstone of the absolutely fantastic film The Last Duel, this one was legally sanctioned, but took place about 30 years after the one depicted by Ridley Scott, Matt Damon, Ben Affleck and Jodie Comer. Now, while the fight in The Last Duel between Matt Damon's Jean de Carouge and Adam Driver's Jacques Legris was fought by two friends from Normandy, this one that I'm going to talk about today was actually fought by two members of the same Irish family. And it wasn't about a allegation of sexual assault. It was over a castle in County Tipperary. My name is Ruadh Butler, and I write novels about the 12th century Ireland, particularly about the Norman invasion of Ireland. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, do check out the description and you'll find links to the books. But on with the story today. And today we're going to jump forward from the 12th century to the 15th century, the early 15th century, to talk about Kiltinan Castle in County Tipperary. Kiltinan Castle stands on an imposing but extremely picturesque location on a rock outcropping in the shadow of a mountain called Slieve na Mon in County Tipperary, in the southeastern bit of County Tipperary. The castle itself is about 5 kilometers east of the medieval walled town of Fethard, and is strategically situated in sort of above a ravine which overlooks the Clashawley River. It also guards the sort of very rich pasture lands of very good farming country of the Suir River Valley, which sort of runs east-west between Waterford, past Carrick, Clonmel and Caircastle, to Cashel, which was the seat of the Archbishops of Cashel, a very important person in those days. It's also within view of the pass between the Walsh Mountains and the hills of Middle Third, between which I would presume that most travellers coming from Kilkenny or Leinster really, and travelling towards Cork, they'd pass through here. So it was an incredibly important position for a castle to stand in those days. Now, it was built back in at some point between the 1185 and 1200 by the Anglo-Norman knight Philip de Worcester, and he'd arrived in Ireland as a follower of Prince John, the youngest son of Henry II of England, in 1185, and was granted pretty much the whole of southern Tipperary to hold on behalf of the English crown. Philip de Worcester's daughter, Basilia de Worcester, had actually married another knight, an Anglo-Norman knight called Mylor de Birmingham. And as you can imagine, I must do a video about this family. The de Birminghams were actually from the Midlands and from what would later become this huge city in the Midlands called Birmingham. But when they left, it was just a little village. So I'll have to do a video about this very interesting family as well in the future. But for now, we're back in the 12th century. Basilia de Worcester has married Mylor de Birmingham, and their family would hold Kiltinan Castle for the next couple of hundred years. And but the Birmingham's main estates in Ireland were actually over in County Galway, around Dunmore and principally in Athenry. So in 1410, one of the Birminghams, a Walter de Birmingham, he actually decided to sell the property. And the man he sold the property to was called Thomas Butler, who was the prior of Kilmainham. What to say about him? This land sale was actually later disputed by another cousin of Thomas Butler's, and it would lead to a duel in 1420. How did this come about? Well, in 1350, some 60 years or 70 years before the actual duel took place, a chap called Pierce Butler, 2nd Baron Dunboyne, had married Catherine de Birmingham, a daughter of one of the holders of Kiltinan. And their grandson, Edmund, who was actually the 6th Baron Dunboyne, well, he believed that because of this marriage between his grandparents, he had rights to Kiltinan, which completely overrode the sale of the castle to Prior Thomas. Now, as you may have clocked, Prior Thomas Butler and Edmund Butler, Lord Dunboyne, were actually members of the same family, the same one as me, the Butlers, an Anglo-Norman dynasty who were based Tipperary, Kilkenny region in this time frame. And how were they related? Well, the 1st Baron Dunboyne was actually the uncle of the 1st Earl of Ormond, a younger brother of the the Earl of Ormond's father. And Prior Thomas was actually an illegitimate son of the third Earl of Ormond. So pretty close familial link between these families. But that familial link did not mean that they were the best of friends, particularly when land and titles and money came into it. However, the Dunboyne family had actually been resident up in Meath since the 1320s, when the first Baron had actually married an heiress called Sonolda Le Petit. Now, by 1400, when our story starts, they were beginning to build up a bit of an estate. They presumably had a bit of an estate in Tipperary throughout that time frame, and had become relatively important within the Tipperary as kinsmen of the Butler Earls of Ormond, who were the local overlords. Now, normally a Baron of Dunboyne standing would have had no problem in seeing off any claim of an illegitimate member of his family in such circumstances as these. But this situation was different because Prior Thomas was, despite his illegitimate birth, an extremely important man in the colony, in the Lordship of Ireland in the 15th century. As I say, he was born to the third Earl of Ormond, probably around 1380, but he, in 1403, when he was in his early 20s, he was actually appointed prior of the Hospital of Kilmainham, which made him head of the Order of Knights Hospitaller in Ireland. And this is presumably due to his father's influence. His election was actually contested by the English Order, who were at that time trying to put their control over the Irish Hospitallers, but he was eventually recognised in 1407. He was also a military man, and he had fought the Battle of the Bloody Bank near Bray against the O'Byrnes of Wicklow back in 1402. That was so named because so much O'Byrne blood was spilled in the River Dargle that it was forever known as the Bloody Bank thereafter. Now, as prior of Kilmainham, Thomas was also the head of a large army of warrior monks, and he was very active in the defence of the Lordship of Ireland, particularly around Kilkenny and Tipperary during the minority of his nephew, the fourth Earl of Ormond. So he must have been pretty close to this new Earl of Ormond, the fourth Earl. But it was also this ability in battle and his success in that front that led to his appointment as Deputy Lord Lieutenant, or what we'll call Lord Deputy, by Thomas of Lancaster, the Duke of Clarence, who was the favourite son of Henry IV, King Henry IV of England. And he left Thomas the Prior in control of Ireland, or much of Ireland, in early 1409. Now that he was powerful and influential, both politically and militarily, Prior Thomas actually decided that he needed to use this office that he had secured to win lands for his sons, because despite being a member of a monastic order, he'd actually got a couple of sons at least. And so the year after this appointment as Lord Deputy, he purchased Kiltinan Castle down in Tipperary from the Birmingham family. Now, his 4 years as Lord Deputy were not without problems. He twice refused to obey summonses from King Henry IV to face charges of misconduct. So that's pretty serious, but he did his best, and he still defended the colony, the Lordship of Ireland. However, his period in office actually ended in 1413, and so yeah, he had held the castle of Kiltinan for 3 years by this point. Presumably, even maybe visited it a couple of times, and yet during his lifetime, Lord Dunboyne never put forward his claim to Kiltinan that we know of. In 1417 and 1418, Prior Thomas was actually engaged in a private war against the Burkes and the Talbot family. The head of the Talbot family had actually replaced him as Lord Deputy in 1413. And here we have Prior Thomas actually fighting a feud against them. And this feud would actually come to dominate pretty much Irish politics for the next 20 years, because it would be taken on by Prior Thomas's half-brother, the Earl of Ormond, into the 1420s and 1430s. He was again, this is the Prior Thomas, was again summoned to face King Henry V, but he again just refused to leave Ireland, and nothing came of it. So there was presumably a bit of enmity between the royal family under Henry V and this prior of Kilmainham, Thomas Butler. It kind of came to an end in 1419 because Thomas decided that he would happily lead an army of some 700 soldiers from Ireland and go over to France to help Henry V at the siege of Rouen, which of course Henry V, having invaded France in 1415, was pretty much the defining feature, or this had now become the 100 Years' War. And here we have Thomas Butler, the prior, fighting on behalf of Henry V in France. And unfortunately, in 1420, he died, leaving two illegitimate sons, who I can only presume were in their late teens, early 20s in 1420. And it seems like absolutely no coincidence to me that the same year as prior Thomas died was when Lord Dunboyne chose to renew his claim over Kiltinan Castle in Tipperary and made contact with the Earl of Ormond about progressing this claim. By 1420, the Earl of Ormond was himself only in his early 30s, and he'd just been appointed Lord Deputy of Ireland by Henry V. He was also Lord Palatine of the County of Tipperary, a hereditary position which meant that he was legally the owner of everything. Even the king would have had to answer to him if a crime had happened in Tipperary. So whatever way you cut it, it was going to fall to Ormond, the Earl of Ormond, to decide the matter between these two over Kiltinan Castle. Now, it's only my opinion, but I suspect Dunboyne's case would have been something along the lines of illegitimate sons aren't able to inherit property from their father. Thus, the castle has to come to me. I suspect that's what he would have put forward. Well, I have no evidence to it, but I hesitate. I think it would have been the way forward for him. Now, had Ormond, as Lord Lieutenant or Lord Palatine of Tipperary, allowed this argument to carry the day, it would have opened up numerous cases across Ireland of the same kind. Because in the law of Ireland, which we now call Brehon law, unlike that of England, illegitimacy wasn't really a barrier to inheritance. And so I suspect that many powerful families would have actually waited on the outcome of this case with very great interest, because the future of their lands could therefore have precedent. This could have precedent over cases that members of their own family or kin could have against them. And so what would have been the outcome if Ormond had found in favour of Dunboyne at this point? Well, you could just imagine that cases would have flowed into the courts, and violence would have been because many Irish families, their response to legal issues was to rise in rebellion and rise in a very violent way. So I think that way was closed to Ormond to declare in that way. Now, but at the same time, Ormond couldn't really afford to upset Dunboyne on a very personal level, because no matter how what he believed just in the case, he needed Dunboyne to provide warriors to defend not only Tipperary in Ireland, but also for potentially service overseas. And there's no doubt that if Ormond had ruled against Dunboyne, Dunboyne would have not only stopped providing warriors, but he might have even risen and attacked Ormond's lands in Ormond's absence up in Dublin and in England. So from Ormond's point of view, whatever he decides is going to have a negative effect on his rule of Ireland, his term in office, and potentially on his land directly as well. So in those circumstances, Ormond decided to look to a higher power to decide the matter. And yes, you've guessed it, he offloaded the matter to God. And how might God decide who had the right to the castle in South Tipperary, you might ask? Well, just like in the film, The Last Duel, where King Charles VI decided a duel should be fought, Ormond went the same way. He decided that the two knights, or the two selected people from the family, would have to duke it out with broadswords, and that the survivor would be considered he who God favoured and would come into possession of Kiltinan Castle. So consequently, in spring 1420, Lord Dunboyne and Prior Thomas's teenage son, Edmund Butler, fought a duel to the death on the green below Kiltinan Castle. Now, apparently the two men were pretty well matched, for the duel went on for most of the day. And we only know certain things. We don't even know if it started on horse and lance before concluding with sword and shield on their feet, or perhaps if there were other rules in place. If someone wanted to yield, was that allowed, or did they have to fight on to the death? But this had a, as we said, this had a major. The outcome of this duel would have major implications for the rest of Ireland. So I presume that quite a few people have come to watch it, just out of a kind of macabre interest, I suppose, as well. Now, late in the day, the duel was actually decided when just surprisingly, I think it happened that Lord Dunboyne was killed, meaning that Edmund Butler, the prior's son, was actually declared the victor. Sadly, he would only enjoy this very famous victory for only a brief time, because he had been fatally wounded in the fight and actually succumbed to his injuries the very next day. Nevertheless, he won and was declared the victor, and they said that, I presume the Earl of Ormond was on hand to say, "There's your winner, take the castle." And his younger brother Thomas first took hold of Kiltinan, and then at some point over the next couple of decades, his son, who was another Edmund Butler, the nephew of Edmund the duelist, he actually decided in 1452 to convey his interest in the property to the 8th Baron Dunboyne, who was a nephew of the duelist Dunboyne. Now, why he did this, you wonder. Apparently, the Dunboynes kept up their kind of legal interest in the castle and continued to try to gain it through a legal way. And I would just imagine that maybe the second Edmund Butler didn't have any children or anyone else to leave the castle to, and was just financially exhausted by all these legal cases. So that's why he conveyed it over to the Lord Dunboyne. Maybe there was money changed hands in the other direction. In any event, this 8th Baron Dunboyne had actually become a pretty trusted supporter of the House of Ormond. He was also Seneschal of Tipperary for the absentee Ormonds. So he was a pretty powerful man. He had also a lot of property around Fethard and the barony of Middlethird. So it just became difficult for Edmund Butler to hold on to this one castle in a sea of Dunboyne power. Now, as far as I can ascertain, the second Edmund Butler was the last descendant of Prior Thomas. I'd love to know if you know any differently than that. Please let me know, because I'd love to hear more. But the Barons Dunboyne, now that they had got control of Kiltinan, would actually remain in control of the castle until the 16th century, or through the 16th century, I should say, when they had actually become very powerful in the region, and actually were getting into a position where they could actually challenge the power of the Earls of Ormond over in Kilkenny. Now, interestingly, in 1627, another Edmund Butler, who was the 13th Baron Dunboyne, he actually murdered one of his cousins, a guy called James Prendergast, in yet another dispute over land in Tipperary. So that's a very famous one. Unfortunately, I just don't have time to talk about it at this point. Yes, so the Dunboynes continued to hold Kiltinan Castle until the 16th into the 17th century, when James Butler, the 14th Baron Dunboyne, was in control of the castle. Now, in 1642, like most of the Butlers, he had declared loyalty to the Confederacy of Kilkenny, this Catholic assembly which professed loyalty to King Charles I, all the while ruling most of Ireland in opposition to the king's appointed deputies up in Dublin. So they had been in control of much of Ireland, but in 1649, Oliver Cromwell, the parliamentarian general, invaded Ireland and dispossessed most of the Catholic nobility, including Lord Dunboyne. And basically, what they said famously is "to hell or to Connaught." So what that meant was you could either keep your lands and we'll kill you, or you can exchange your lands in lovely, lovely South Tipperary and take lands over in the Shannon in the province of Connaught. And at that point in 1650, the Dunboynes lost their hold on Kiltinan Castle, this castle that they had bled for, died for, and fought for the guts of 40 years. What happened after that? Well, the new government, this Cromwellian government, granted Kiltinan to a chap called Richard Staper. And around 1669, he actually sold it to another Englishman called Peter Cook. And it changed hands a few more times. And in 1918, the castle was in the hands of the de Sales-le-Terrier family, who made it into a racehorse stud. And it's now owned by none other than the composer, Andrew Lloyd Webber, and his wife, Lady Lloyd Webber. I would imagine that this duel at Kiltinan probably won't serve as the backdrop to the next Andrew Lloyd Webber stage show, but given what we've seen in Game of Thrones with the fight between the Mountain and the Prince Oberyn, and more recently in Sir Ridley Scott's film, The Last Duel, I hope you'll agree that this fight between the two members of the Butler family has quite a bit of theatre to it. And I hope that means that you might consider leaving a comment, giving it a share, or just giving it a thumbs up. Yeah, so that's the story of Kiltinan Castle and the duel between the two members of the Butler family. Thank you for watching. I'm Ruadh Butler. Once again, just a little plug for my books, which you'll find a link to down in the description. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.